The channel waters churned black beneath Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's landing craft, as it pitched violently through the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. Salt spray stung his weathered face while he gripped the steel rail, watching the dark silhouettes of Normandy's cliffs emerge like ancient guardians from the mist. Around him, 225 Rangers of the 2nd Battalion sat in grim silence, their blackened faces reflecting the gravity of their impossible mission. 30 minutes to Point Du Hoc, shouted the coxswain over the roar of engines and crashing waves. Rudder's stomach tightened. Intelligence reports had painted a terrifying picture of their objective. A 100-foot cliff fortress bristling with German artillery pieces, capable of obliterating the landing forces at Utah. In Omaha beaches, 6 massive guns, each capable of hurling shells 14 miles, commanded the entire invasion sector from their concrete emplacements atop the limestone precipice. The young Texan officer had volunteered his elite unit for what many considered a suicide mission: scale the sheer cliffs under enemy fire, neutralize the battery, and hold the position until relieved. Simple in concept, devastating in execution. Weather conditions had already delayed the invasion by 24 hours, and now rough seas threatened to scatter their small fleet of landing craft like leaves in a storm. Behind them, the largest armada in human history pressed forward through the darkness. 5,000 ships carrying 150,000 Allied soldiers from 12 nations surged toward the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall that Adolf Hitler had proclaimed impregnable. Operation Overlord, 3 years in the planning, would succeed or fail on the courage of men like these Rangers, who accepted death as a likely outcome. Rudder studied his men in the dim light. Sergeant Leonard Lomel from New Jersey sat methodically, checking his Thompson submachine gun. Private First Class Carl Weiss from Virginia traced rosary beads with trembling fingers. These weren't professional killers or hardened veterans, they were farmers, factory workers, and college students transformed by war into instruments of liberation. According to detailed accounts from the Combined Operations Historical Section, the Rangers had trained for months on similar cliffs along the English coast, perfecting techniques that seemed borrowed from mountaineering rather than military science. They carried rocket-fired grappling hooks, extension ladders borrowed from London Fire Brigade, and toggle ropes that would either save their lives or become their funeral shrouds. The German defenders weren't sleeping. From his command bunker, Major Werner Pluskett of the 352nd Artillery Regiment scanned the horizon. Through powerful binoculars, something massive was moving out there beyond the range of his spotlights. Radio chatter from coastal observation posts spoke of engine sounds and strange shadows on the water, but thick clouds obscured the moon, making positive identification impossible. Pluskett had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred to the supposedly quiet sector. The Atlantic Wall might look impregnable to German propaganda photographers, but the Major knew its weaknesses. Concrete and steel meant nothing without sufficient troops to man the positions, and many of his best soldiers had been transferred to Russia or Italy. What remained were old men, boys barely out of training, and reluctant conscripts from occupied territories. As the first gray fingers of dawn touched the eastern horizon, both sides prepared for a collision that would determine the fate of European civilization. In landing craft scattered across miles of heaving sea, Allied soldiers checked weapons and whispered prayers in a dozen languages. Behind Hitler's Atlantic Wall, German machine gunners loaded ammunition belts and sighted their weapons on predetermined killing zones. The longest day was about to begin. The first rocket-propelled grappling hook whistled through the dawn air and clattered against the limestone face of Point Du Hoc. At exactly 6:45 on the morning of June 6th, machine gun fire immediately erupted from the German positions above, sending bullets ricocheting off the cliff face in deadly showers of sparks and stone fragments. Sergeant Leonard Lomel threw himself against the base of the cliff as a potato. Masher grenade exploded 10 feet away, showering him with dirt and debris. The Rangers had landed 20 minutes behind schedule due to strong currents, giving the German defenders precious time to prepare their reception. Now every second counted as Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's men scrambled to establish their precarious foothold on the narrow beach. "Get those hooks up there," Rudder roared over the din of battle, his voice barely audible above the crash of artillery shells from German positions further inland. The plan had called for a swift, coordinated assault up multiple climbing routes, but enemy fire had already damaged several of their specialized ladders and killed 3 Rangers. Before they could even begin their ascent, Private First Class Carl Weiss grabbed a toggle rope and began climbing, his boots scraping against the crumbling chalk face as bullets whined past his head. Behind him, Ranger Jack Coon followed with a Browning automatic rifle slung across his back, ready to provide, covering fire once they reached the top. The cliff seemed to stretch upward forever. Each hand held a potential death trap where German defenders could easily pick off the climbers. From his command post, Major Werner Pluskett watched in amazement as the American soldiers continued their impossible climb despite murderous fire from above. These weren't ordinary infantry. They moved with the precision and determination of elite troops, using tactics he'd never seen before. When one rope was cut by enemy fire, 3 more appeared. When a climber fell, the others immediately took his place. The German major had received fragmentary reports throughout the early morning hours of massive Allied landings along the entire Normandy coast. Radio communications were sporadic due to Allied jamming, but it was clear that this assault on Point du Hoc was part of something much larger. From his position, he could see the dark shapes of Allied warships on the horizon, their guns already beginning to find the range of German positions. Sergeant Lommel reached the top of the cliff after a grueling 15-minute climb that felt like hours, rolling over the edge. He immediately came face to face with a young German soldier who seemed as surprised as he was. The Nazi trooper fumbled for his rifle, but Lommel was faster, dropping him with a burst from his Thompson submachine gun. Behind him, more Rangers were pulling themselves over the precipice, creating a small but growing foothold on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The landscape that greeted them bore little resemblance to their intelligence photographs. Allied naval bombardment had transformed the once pristine gun emplacements into a moonscape of smoking craters and twisted metal. Concrete bunkers stood empty, their steel doors hanging open like broken teeth. Most shocking of all, the massive artillery pieces they had risked everything to destroy were nowhere to be seen. "Where are the guns?" shouted Private Harry Fate as he sprinted across the cratered ground, dodging sniper fire from a damaged observation tower. The absence of their primary targets created a terrifying possibility. Had German intelligence discovered the invasion plans and moved the artillery to alternate positions, where they could still devastate the main landing beaches, as detailed in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive account D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Rangers found themselves in a deadly maze of trenches, bomb craters, and underground tunnels that connected the various defensive positions. German resistance was fierce but disorganized, with individual soldiers and small groups fighting desperately from whatever cover they could find. Rudder established his command post in a captured German bunker using a damaged field telephone to report their precarious situation to the Naval Task Force offshore. His Rangers controlled perhaps 100 yards of cliff top, but German counterattacks were already forming in the inland hedgerows. Without reinforcement, his small force would be overwhelmed within hours. The sounds of battle echoed across the Norman countryside as Allied forces struggled to establish themselves on the continent of Europe. At Point du Hoc, 39 Rangers had already paid the ultimate price for their foothold on French soil. Dawn's pale light revealed the full extent of the deception as Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Coon moved cautiously through the inland hedgerows beyond Point du Hoc. The massive artillery pieces that had threatened the entire invasion fleet were not in their expected positions. The concrete emplacements held nothing but telephone poles, painted to resemble gun barrels, an elaborate ruse designed to draw Allied attention away from the real battery. "Tracks," whispered Coon, pointing to deep ruts in the muddy farm road that disappeared into a grove of apple trees. 600 yards south of the cliff, the wheel marks were wide and heavy, exactly what would be left by the massive carriages needed to move the German 155mm guns. Both Rangers checked their weapons and began following the trail, knowing that every minute of delay meant more Allied soldiers dying on the beaches below. Back at the cliff top, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder faced a desperate situation. German counterattacks had reduced his effective force to fewer than 60 men, and ammunition was running critically low. The promised relief from the 5th Ranger Battalion had not materialized. Those units were pinned down on Omaha Beach, fighting for their own survival against determined German resistance. Radio operator James Eichner crouched in a shell crater, frantically trying to establish contact with the Naval Task Force offshore. His radio had been damaged during the cliff assault, producing only static and broken fragments of transmission without communication. The Rangers were cut off from artillery support and medical evacuation for their growing number of wounded. "Sir," "We've got movement to the south," called out Private First Class Otto Stevens from his position in a damaged German machine gun nest. Through the morning haze, he could see figures in field gray uniforms assembling in the village of Kriegwallenbessen. German reinforcements from the 352nd Artillery Regiment were preparing for a coordinated assault to retake their strategic position. Meanwhile, Lommel and Kuhn had discovered something that would change the course of the battle. Hidden beneath camouflage netting in the apple orchard, they found all 6 of the missing artillery pieces, massive German guns, pointed directly at Utah Beach, where thousands of American troops were struggling to establish their beachhead. The weapons were unguarded except for a single sentry, who appeared to be sleeping in early morning stillness. The 2 Rangers exchanged glances. Understanding the magnitude of their discovery, these guns could destroy the entire 4th Infantry Division landing force with concentrated fire. Every shell that reached the beach would kill dozens of American soldiers, who had no idea death was waiting in this peaceful Norman orchard. Moving silently through the tall grass, they approached the artillery positions from the rear. Lommel carried thermite grenades specifically designed to destroy heavy weapons, while Kuhn provided security with his Browning automatic rifle. The sleeping German guard never stirred. As the American sergeants went to work on their deadly mission, thermite burned at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel and render the sophisticated gun mechanisms permanently inoperable. Lommel placed charges in the breech mechanisms of the first 3 weapons, while Kuhn watched for any sign of German patrols. The distinctive smell of burning metal began to fill the orchard as the thermite did its deadly work. According to historian Gordon Harrison's official account, cross-channel attack, this moment represented one of the most crucial tactical victories of the entire Normandy invasion. The destruction of these artillery pieces ensured that Utah Beach would remain viable for the massive logistics operation that would follow the initial assault. A German patrol appeared on the road just as the Rangers finished destroying the last gun. 6 enemy soldiers armed with submachine guns were returning from a reconnaissance mission, laughing and talking as they approached the orchard. They had no idea that their supposedly secret artillery position had been discovered and neutralized by 2 American soldiers operating miles behind enemy lines. Kuhn sighted his automatic rifle on the lead German while Lommel prepared his last thermite grenade. The fate of thousands of Allied soldiers depended on these 2 men completing their mission and escaping to report their success. The Battle of Normandy hung in the balance of this single encounter in an apple orchard that most maps didn't even bother to name. Major Werner Pluskett assembled his remaining forces in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing for what he knew would be the decisive counterattack to retake Point du Hoc. His 352nd Artillery Regiment had been scattered by the Allied naval bombardment, but he still commanded nearly 200 soldiers from various units that had been cut off from their parent commands during the chaotic first hours of the invasion. Among his troops were veterans of the Russian front who understood urban warfare, young conscripts from the Hitler Youth who possessed fanatical determination despite their inexperience, and Eastern European volunteers whose loyalty to the German cause remained questionable. It was a mixed force, but Pluskett had welded them into an effective fighting unit through months of defensive training. Along the Norman coast, the Americans cannot be allowed to hold that position, he told his assembled officers in the damaged church of Kriegwallenbessen. Every hour they remain on our soil brings more Allied reinforcements across the channel. We attack at 100 hours with everything we have. At Point du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder had established a defensive perimeter, using captured German positions and natural features of the bomb-cratered landscape. His Rangers occupied a roughly circular area, perhaps 300 yards in diameter, with the cliff face protecting their rear, but also cutting off any hope of retreat. They would hold this ground or die trying. There were no other options. Corpsman Wayne Mitchell moved from position to position, treating wounded Rangers with whatever medical supplies remained in his depleted aid bag. The casualty rate had been horrific during the initial assault, and German sniper fire continued to take its toll throughout the morning hours. Every man knew that medical evacuation was impossible until communication could be re-established with the fleet offshore. Private First Class Carl Wiest had found an excellent firing position in a collapsed German bunker that overlooked the main approach road from the south. His Springfield rifle was zeroed for 200 yards, and he had carefully counted his remaining ammunition, 37 rounds to hold off what intelligence reports suggested. could be a reinforced German company, the first German probe came. At 7:30, a squad of soldiers moving cautiously through the hedgerows while trying to determine American positions and strength. Ranger machine gunner Otto Stevens let them approach within 50 yards before opening fire with his captured German MG-42, cutting down 3 enemy soldiers and sending the survivors scrambling for cover behind a destroyed farmhouse. "Here they come," shouted Sergeant Leonard Lommel, who had returned from his successful mission to destroy the hidden artillery. Just minutes before the German assault began, he and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn had barely made it back to friendly lines before Plusgat's counterattack commenced in earnest. Their report about the destroyed guns was the first good news Rudder had received since landing on the Norman coast. The main German assault struck the southern perimeter with devastating force. The full platoons of infantry supported by a single Panzermark IV tank advanced across the open ground, using covering fire from mortars positioned in the village beyond. The ancient tank's 75mm gun began systematically destroying Ranger positions, while German infantry rushed forward in small groups. As documented in the official Army Historical Division records, the Rangers' defense of Point du Hoc became one of the most heroic small unit actions in military history. Outnumbered nearly 4-1, the Americans used superior marksmanship and intimate knowledge of the terrain to extract a terrible prize from their attackers. Bazooka operator Harry Fake crawled through a drainage ditch to get within range of the German tank, his rocket launcher loaded with their last anti-tank round. The Panzer's machine gun swept the area with long bursts, searching for the American position while the main gun continued its methodical destruction of Ranger defensive positions. Radio operator James Eichner finally managed to establish contact with USS Satterlee, one of the destroyers providing fire support for the invasion. "This is Point du Hoc. We are under heavy attack. Request immediate naval gunfire support," he shouted into his damaged radio set, hoping the message would reach friendly forces before his position was overrun. The German attack reached its crescendo as enemy soldiers breached the outer perimeter and began fighting their way through the maze of craters and trenches toward Rudder's command post. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in a dozen locations as Rangers and German soldiers met in desperate close-quarters battle that would determine control of this crucial piece of French soil. The radio call from Point du Hoc crackled through the static aboard USS Satterlee as Lieutenant Commander George Marshall plotted firing coordinates on his navigation chart. The destroyer had been providing fire support for Utah Beach when the desperate plea for help arrived from Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's embattled Rangers. Within minutes, the warship was racing through the choppy channel waters toward the German-held coastline. "All stop. Prepare for naval gunfire mission," Marshall ordered as his ship took position 3 miles offshore from the towering cliffs. The destroyer's 5-inch guns swiveled toward their target, while fire control officers calculated range and bearing based on the fragmentary coordinates provided by the Rangers' damaged radio equipment. On the cliff top, Ranger radio operator James Eichner guided the incoming fire mission, while German soldiers advanced within grenade range of his position. "Target bearing to 70 degrees, range 600 yards from our position," he shouted into his handset, hoping the naval gunners could distinguish between friend and foe in the smoke and confusion of close combat. The first salvo arrived with the distinctive whistle of incoming naval shells, followed by earth-shaking explosions that lifted German soldiers off their feet and sent debris flying in all directions. The German tank that had been systematically destroying Ranger positions took a direct hit from a 5-inch shell, its ammunition cooking off in a spectacular fireball that illuminated the battlefield like daylight. Major Werner Plusgat found himself trapped in a nightmare of American naval gunfire that transformed his carefully planned assault into a desperate struggle for survival. His radio operator was dead, killed by shell fragments during the first salvo, and communication with his scattered units had become impossible. The attack was collapsing, but retreat across open ground under naval bombardment would be equally suicidal. Sergeant Leonard Lommel seized the initiative as German resistance began to waver under the devastating fire from offshore, leading a squad of Rangers in a counterattack. He advanced through the smoke and debris toward the German positions in the southern hedgerows. These were the same fields where he had destroyed the hidden artillery battery hours earlier, but now they had become a battlefield littered with the casualties of modern warfare. Private First Class Carl Weist had expended all but 3 rounds of his rifle ammunition when he spotted a German soldier Attempting to set up a mortar in a shell crater 50 yards away, his Springfield cracked once, and the enemy soldier collapsed over his weapon. The bullets left, and at least a dozen German troops still visible in his sector of the perimeter. According to Stephen Ambrose's detailed research in D-Day, the naval gunfire support proved decisive in breaking the back of German resistance. Around Point Duhok, the precision fire from USS Satterlee and other destroyers offshore demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of close naval support. When properly coordinated with ground forces, Corpsman Wayne Mitchell continued moving between wounded Rangers, using strips torn from German uniforms to create makeshift bandages when his medical supplies ran out. The list of casualties continued to grow. Sergeant Oliver Reed killed by mortar fire, Private James Parker wounded by grenade fragments, Corporal William Anderson missing in action during the confused fighting in the hedgerows. The German counterattack finally broke at 10:15 in the morning when Major Pluskett ordered his surviving troops to withdraw to secondary positions inland. His 352nd Artillery Regiment had suffered catastrophic losses. Attempting to retake the clifftop position and continuing the assault would only result in the complete destruction of his remaining forces. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder surveyed his battered perimeter as the sounds of battle gradually faded into the distance. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at Point Duhok 6 hours earlier, fewer than 40 remained effective for combat. The others were dead, wounded, or missing in the maze of trenches and craters that had become their battlefield, but they had succeeded in their impossible mission. The German artillery battery that could have destroyed Utah Beach lay in ruins, its massive guns rendered permanently inoperable by thermite charges. The strategic clifftop position remained in American hands, denying the Germans a crucial observation post overlooking the entire invasion sector. Radio operator Eichner finally established reliable communication with the invasion command ship, reporting their success and desperate need for medical evacuation and resupply. Relief forces from the 5th Ranger Battalion were fighting their way inland from Omaha Beach, but it would be hours before they could reach the isolated defenders of Point Duhok. The morning phase of the battle was over, but the longest day was far from finished for the heroes who had scaled Hitler's Atlantic Wall and lived to tell about it. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the crater-marked landscape of Point Duhok as Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder counted his remaining effective soldiers, 38 Rangers still capable of fighting, with ammunition running dangerously low and no prospect of immediate relief. The promised reinforcement from the 5th Ranger Battalion had been delayed by fierce German resistance at Omaha Beach, leaving his men isolated behind enemy lines. Corpsman Wayne Mitchell had established a makeshift aid station in a captured German bunker, treating 17 wounded Rangers with medical supplies salvaged from enemy positions. Private James Parker lay unconscious with a severe head wound, while Sergeant William Hayes attempted to clean a through-and-through bullet wound in his left shoulder, using water from a German canteen and strips of cloth torn from a Nazi flag. "Sir, we've got movement on the eastern approach," reported Private First Class Otto Stevens from his observation post in a damaged concrete emplacement. Through his binoculars, he could see German soldiers positioning themselves in the hedgerows, beyond effective rifle range, apparently preparing for another assault. These weren't the same troops they had repelled earlier. These appeared to be fresh reinforcements from inland garrisons. Radio operator James Eichner maintained sporadic contact with the Naval Task Force offshore, but communications remained unreliable due to damaged equipment and German jamming efforts. The latest intelligence indicated that Allied forces had successfully established beachheads at all 5 landing sites, but the situation remained critical at Omaha Beach, where heavy casualties had been inflicted by determined German defenders. Sergeant Leonard Lomel organized the remaining Rangers into 3-man fighting positions, maximizing their defensive firepower while conserving precious ammunition. Each soldier had been reduced to fewer than 20 rounds, forcing them to make every shot count in any future engagement. The Thompson submachine guns that had been so effective during the cliff assault were now nearly useless due to lack of ammunition. The German forces gathering in the distance belonged to Kampfer Meyer, a reinforced battalion scraped together from various coastal defense units and inland training schools. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Meyer had received orders directly from Wehrmacht headquarters to retake Point Duhok at any cost, understanding that American control of the clifftop position threatened the entire defensive line. Along this section of the Norman coast. As documented in the German military archives captured after the war, Meyer commanded approximately 400 soldiers supported by 3 armored vehicles and multiple mortar sections. His plan called for a coordinated assault from 3 directions, designed to overwhelm the depleted American garrison through sheer weight of numbers. Private First Class Carl Wiest had found a new fighting position in a shell crater that provided excellent fields of fire toward the most likely German approach routes. His Springfield rifle was down to its last clip, but he had acquired a German Karabiner 98 with nearly 60 rounds of ammunition from a dead enemy soldier. The weapon felt strange in his hands, but desperate circumstances required adaptation. The afternoon attack began at 14:30 hours with a concentrated mortar barrage that sent Rangers scrambling for whatever cover they could find in the bomb-scarred landscape. German shells systematically targeted every visible American position, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down while enemy infantry advanced under the protective fire. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder moved from position to position during the bombardment, encouraging his men and coordinating their defense. Despite the continuing rain of explosive shells, a near miss showered him with dirt and debris, but he continued his rounds, understanding that leadership visibility was crucial for maintaining morale. Among his exhausted troops, the main German assault came from the southeast, where Kampfrupp, Meyer's first company, advanced in rushes across the open ground between the hedgerows and the American perimeter. These soldiers moved with the professional competence of experienced troops, using covering fire and tactical balance to minimize their exposure to Ranger marksmen. Bazooka operator Harry Fate had saved his last rocket for this moment, waiting until a German armored car approached within effective range before triggering his weapon. The rocket struck the vehicle's front armor, disabling it and killing several infantry soldiers who had been using it for cover. During their advance, the battle raged for 2 hours as German troops repeatedly assaulted the Ranger positions, each attack breaking against the determined American defense, but gradually wearing down the outnumbered garrison. By 16:30 hours, Rudder's effective force had been reduced to 26 men, and his ammunition situation had become critical. Then, just as the situation appeared hopeless, the distinctive sound of American voices could be heard approaching. From the west, the 5th Ranger Battalion had finally broken through German defensive lines and was advancing to relieve their embattled comrades at Point du Hoc. The sound of American voices calling passwords through the hedgerows west of Point du Hoc brought tears of relief to Rangers who had fought continuously for nearly 12 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider's 5th Ranger Battalion had finally broken through the German defensive lines at Omaha Beach, fighting a series of running battles across 3 miles of Norman countryside to reach their isolated comrades. Tally-ho, tally-ho, came the recognition signal as elements of Company A, 5th Rangers, appeared through the smoke and debris of the battlefield. Captain Arnold Bloom led his troops into the American perimeter just as Kampfrupp Meyer launched what would prove to be their final assault on the cliff-top position. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder embraced his fellow officer with the grim satisfaction of a soldier who had completed an impossible mission and lived to see relief arrive. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at Point du Hoc that morning, 41 remained effective for combat. The others were dead, wounded, or missing in the maze of trenches and craters that had become their battlefield. The arrival of fresh troops and ammunition transformed the tactical situation completely. German forces that had pressed their attacks against a handful of exhausted Americans now faced a reinforced position manned by elite troops with adequate supplies and supporting weapons. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Meyer ordered his surviving forces to withdraw to prepared positions further inland. Corpsman Wayne Mitchell finally received the medical supplies and evacuation support his wounded Rangers desperately needed. Helicopters were not yet available for battlefield evacuation, but landing craft braved German artillery fire to reach the narrow beach at the base of the cliffs, carrying away those Rangers whose wounds required immediate hospital treatment. Private First Class Carl Wiest sat in a captured German bunker, cleaning his rifle while watching Allied ships continue to arrive offshore. The channel was filled with vessels of every description: transports, landing craft, destroyers, and the massive battleships whose guns had supported the invasion throughout the day. It was the largest armada in human history, and it had succeeded in establishing a permanent foothold on the continent of Europe. Sergeant Leonard Lomel walked through the apple orchard where he and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn had destroyed the German artillery battery that morning. The 6 massive guns lay silent and twisted, their steel components melted by thermite charges into grotesque sculptures of modern warfare. Those weapons would never again threaten Allied soldiers. Fighting to liberate occupied Europe. As evening approached on June 6, 1944, the strategic importance of the Rangers' victory at Point du Hoc became increasingly clear. According to official casualty reports compiled by the Army Historical Division, the destruction of the German artillery battery had prevented an estimated 2,000 Allied casualties on Utah Beach, where the 4th Infantry Division continued to expand their beachhead throughout the day. The clifftop position also provided Allied forces with a crucial observation post, overlooking the entire Normandy invasion sector. Forward observers could now direct naval gunfire against German positions with unprecedented accuracy, while radio operators maintained communication between scattered Allied units advancing inland from the beaches. Major Werner Pluskett, captured during the German withdrawal, expressed amazement at the Rangers' tactical achievement during his interrogation by Allied intelligence officers. The German artillery commander admitted that he had considered Point du Hoc impregnable due to its natural defensive advantages and extensive fortifications. The American assault had succeeded through a combination of superior training, innovative equipment, and extraordinary individual courage. The broader context of Operation Overlord confirmed that the Normandy invasion had achieved its primary objectives despite fierce German resistance. Allied forces had successfully established 5 separate beachheads along the Norman coast, landing over 150,000 troops on the first day. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, made possible by the courage of soldiers like the Rangers who scaled the cliffs of Point du Hoc. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder established his command post in the former German headquarters bunker, from which he could observe the continuing flow of Allied reinforcements across the Channel. Ships arrived throughout the night, discharging troops, vehicles, and supplies that would support the advance into occupied France. The Atlantic Wall had been breached permanently. As dawn broke on June 7th, the surviving Rangers of the 2nd Battalion could see the fruits of their sacrifice spread across the Norman landscape. Allied forces were advancing inland on all fronts, pushing German defenders back from the coastal fortifications they had spent years constructing. The tide of war had turned decisively in favor of the Allied cause. The courage displayed at Point du Hoc would become legendary in military history, representing the finest traditions of American Special Operations Forces. These Rangers had proven that no objective was impossible. When ordinary soldiers were asked to perform extraordinary missions in defense of freedom and human dignity, their legacy would inspire future generations of warriors facing seemingly insurmountable odds.